Welcome to the CTA podcast. Join us as we critically examine the ideological capture of the psychotherapy field. Here we discuss better, common humanity proposals for a fairer society. Our discussions are thought-provoking, and our guests are from diverse backgrounds, bringing unique perspectives to the table. This is the CTA podcast with your hosts, Jaco van Zyl and Christine Seefeng.
Welcome back to our Critical Therapy Anecdote CTA podcast. We are so excited and honored to be sitting with one of our authors, another one of our authors, Kirsty Miller. And Kirsty is a lecturer based in Scotland. After completing her Doctor of Philosophy in Social and Clinical Psychology, her interests turned to investigating the dangers of groupthink and ideological conformity within academia. He is committed to open inquiry in science, is a member of the Heterodox Academy, the Society for Open Inquiry in Behavioural Sciences, and is working towards protecting psychology and academia from the excesses of critical social justice. So, Dr. Miller, welcome so much to the show.
That's a mouthful.
Yeah,
thank you.
I mean, it's incredible. Yes, we are honored that you have some time to meet with us today to talk about your chapter for the book that CTA has put out. And again, the title is Cynical Therapies, Perspectives in the Anti-Therapeutic Nature of Critical Social Justice. So from helping to hating, critical social justice from a social psychology perspective. This is so good and so rich. And so we're so happy to dig into all of this.
Look, we will jump into the chapter after this question, maybe. Where did your interest in this angle, your approach to the topic, come from?
Yeah, thanks, Jaco. Yeah, well, my background is actually initially social psychology. So that is my sort of my special area, I guess, which then kind of branched out into health as well and clinical psychology. But yeah, so social psychology is, I guess I'm going back to my roots. And it's really interesting, you know, when we first started talking about this book, and I've had this germ of a theory for quite a long time, and I'm not going to lie, it was hard to write. It took me a while to sort of organize in my head, because I had these links between what we all see going on in psychology at the moment. Yeah. And some social psychology principles that obviously I've learned about. And I had these sort of germs of ideas and these links, but I thought, how can I put this together coherently? And then it was actually amazing once I started to write it. I mean, hopefully it comes through when you read it. But I thought, wow, it does connect. So for me, anyway, from the perspective I was looking at it I thought, wow, the links are actually, once I started putting it onto paper, I saw them very strongly. So I guess it was just, to me, the model kind of tied it all together in a way that, as I saw, I'd seen these links and they were ringing lots of bells with me. And then when I tried to put it together, I thought, wow, actually, for me, it really did sort of tie together these ideas of the groups and how easy it is for us to kind of show preference to our own group, and to sort of start to demonize other people very, very easily. And I'm not saying that, obviously in my chapter, I'm focusing on critical social justice, but I'm not by any way saying that any of us are immune from it. We all do it. We absolutely all do it. But I think it is so blatant. It is so stark in critical social justice and the way that people who support this idea, the way they behave, the way they talk. To me, it was so blatant that I thought, wow, okay, this is a really good way of illustrating behaviors that we all demonstrate. As I say, we can all fall prey to this. So I think as well, I hope anyway, it's kind of a warning tale as well, as I know much of the book is. But maybe just coming from a slightly different perspective that people maybe haven't quite joined the dots before.
I found that you did a splendid job in doing that.
Thank you.
I come from an analytic perspective, and also from a group analytic perspective.
Yes.
And it was interesting to see the social psychological perspective on polarization eventually degenerating into violent clashes among groups or tribes. Like I said, from the social psychological perspective, and to see what the formulations have been from an analytic perspective, and to see the parallels and how beautifully those speak to each other. And I really appreciate, and I enjoyed reading your chapter.
Thank you, Jacko. That means a lot. And I think I find that really nice, because obviously I know that I'm bringing a slightly different perspective to a lot of the other authors, which I hope is a positive. I really appreciate and have so much admiration for all of the authors in the book, and they come from a perspective that I don't know nearly as much about, for example, yours. And I think it's really nice that I'm able to bring this slightly different perspective, and then if you can also draw parallels as well, that's brilliant, and I think that's part of it, is that we are all drawing from different perspectives, but we are all coming together with sort of making the links and finding a common theme amongst our different perspectives. And it's in such stark contrast, right, to critical social justice, which is I have to take over. I am the only perspective, and I am not, whereas I think what is really nice is that our book has demonstrated how all these different perspectives can complement each other really nicely and bring new insights and bring new ideas that hopefully can benefit everybody. And that is in such contrast to, critical social justice, which is becoming dominant, and that is trying to do away with all that. It's trying to do away with all of our different perspectives.
Right.
Yeah, I would love to just dig right into your chapter, because there was trouble with us getting this book published, and Val has recorded this beautiful intro to kind of paint that picture. And it wasn't until we got the manuscript, Jaco and I, at the same time in advance of publishing, so we could read it, right, for these interviews. And then I was completely blown away and understood exactly why we had trouble getting a publisher. So I mean, just diving right into yours, talking about, you reference right off the bat Nazi Germany, Stalin, Soviet Union, right, Mao's China. We could even say the CCP today. That's just me, Christine. But the atrocities, you make this, but this is the point here, because it's easy for us to kind of demonize the other side, or to be very tyrannical in our response to all of this. And I find myself holding back, because I could very easily just become the very thing that I kind of loathe that's happened on the other side.
It's so easy done. Absolutely.
It's so easy to do. So your perspective, coming from a place of, and maybe you can speak about this more, that the atrocities are not necessarily committed by evil people, but that they may be a compilation over time of ideas and people who thought they were right, and ideas they thought were right, that then built, kind of this movement. And in their desire to be helping, from a perspective, if we give them some credit, some benefit of the doubt, from the perspective of helping folks, how does that turn into where we are today? Starting off with trying to help, and then we turned into hating almost, right, at the same time now.
I think this matters to me so much because it was actually when I was a student myself. So I learned about this when I was a student. And this model that I have used, the collective steps to hate, social identity model, I know I've referenced it more exactly, but it's a bit of a mouthful. I think when I first read about it just really resonated with me. So the original paper, which I talk about a lot in the chapter, it is actually referring to Nazi Germany. It relates to the banality of evil hypothesis. And the idea is that, you know, there is a theory that people do bad things either because they're evil people, or, you know, especially in relation to kind of understanding the Holocaust and the atrocities around what happened in the Third Reich. You know, there is a theory that, you know, it almost became mechanistic for people, you know, the people higher up, obviously, in the Nazis, you know, and they sort of, they were just doing their jobs. You know, that was the argument. Mm-hmm. And, you know, this other perspective, the one by my tutors that I've learned from, so Steve Reicher and colleagues, is that actually it's not that. It's that people do the worst thing that when they believe that what they're doing is right.
Yes.
And it's such a simple thing, right? You know, when I read it, it kind of struck me, and I thought, of course, you know, it explains so many things, you know, even on a personal level, in our personal lives. And again, you know, we can probably all think of examples when we've maybe, I don't know, relished in someone else's, what should we say, you know, failure, or, you know, our nemesis at work, or whatever, you know, or a friend who betrayed us or whatever. And we maybe take revenge, you know, and obviously I'm using, you know, I'm aware that these are very strong words, but, you know, we try and get our own back a little bit, or we don't feel guilty about even, you know, the Schadenfreude, or, you know, we don't feel guilty about it because we think they deserve it. And yeah. I think for me, you know, it resonated on a personal level, and I thought, oh, wow. Yeah, you know, I'm sure I've done that in my life, but also, like we say, on the huge scales that I've mentioned in my chapter, you know, that it does explain so much. In the original paper, you know, it talks about basically that people were so complicit, you know, the theory that people were so either stood back, or, you know, they didn't get involved, or they, you know, they just let it happen, or they actually got engaged. And you think, how could so many people be so evil? And it's hard from, you know, and you guys will know a lot more about this than me, it's hard from a psychological perspective to think there are so many evil people out there in a small area, you know, altogether, you know. And you think, well, actually, to me anyway, it made more sense to think, well, actually, it's not that these were evil people who were just setting out to harm innocent Jews, you know, or, you know, innocent others. It was that they genuinely believed that in this case, you know, the Jewish people were a mortal threat to them. You know, they were a threat to all their values, to their way of life, to the resources available to them. And that, of course, was the rhetoric that was presented by the Nazis. You know, that was very, very intentional. You know, that's the whole point, was that the Jews, again, in this case, were presented as being literally parasites, you know, being used as, you know, I think as well, some of the propaganda from the time, you often see them as rats, or, you know, I think there's a famous one, isn't there,
Swindlers.
like a spider, and absolutely, you know, all these like very threatening, all this very threatening imagery, which was, of course, very intentional. And it was to present that idea that this was a group that is not only, you know, we don't only dislike them, you know, they are distasteful, they are threatening, you know, they are physically threatening, but also they threaten our way of life. They threaten our resources, you know, they're going to take away everything that we value, to the extent that they might even take away those that we love. You know, they are a physical threat, but also an ideological threat. So once a group is presented in that way, it is very, very easy to understand how we can, you know, be drawn and be motivated to try and protect ourselves from them. And once we do that, you know, when we see other people as a threat to us, then it's very easy, you know, it's a very, very small step from that to then starting to celebrate our destruction of them. And I think, to me, you know, and absolutely credit to the original paper, because that was what just struck me. And I thought, wow, that is such it sounds so simple. I mean, I don't know if you feel the same, but to me, when I first read it, I thought, wow, that's such a simple idea, but it's so relevant. Like, it just made
Makes perfect sense.
Yeah,
Makes perfect
absolutely.
sense.
Absolutely.
Because to harm
Yeah.
another person, if you feel like harming another person, you can feel your scruples. No, you don't want to.
Yes.
But to actually
Absolutely.
get
Yes.
yourself to harming the other person, you need to
Yes.
get a mechanism, an internal mechanism to overpower those scruples, to
Yes.
justify what would otherwise have been prohibited.
Yes. Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
on a group level, that follows a similar pattern.
Yeah.
So to
Absolutely.
moralize what would otherwise be
Absolutely.
considered heinous and immoral would be the strategy to get people to commit what they would otherwise not even imagine committing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I believe, I know nothing about it, but I believe that similar strategies can be used in military training.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, it's not my area
Yes.
at all, but again, it makes perfect sense, right? Because for most of us, and again, no one would ever claim that all of our armed forces are evil people
Yes.
who, get pleasure out of or actively want to go and harm other people. As you say, Jaco, people have to work. Most people have to work very, very, very hard to overcome the, our natural desire not to harm other people. So, this is part of the training, is the kind of dehumanization. And I don't know if either of you have seen it, but there's a Black Mirror episode which to me resonates very closely with all this. I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but again, it's kind of very much the idea that the army are programmed into viewing this group and I think actually in the episode they are actually portrayed as almost like sort of cockroaches, and again it's that very, very similar imagery,
Yes.
sort of dirty, harmful, sort of beneath us, very much the dehumanizing. It was such a powerful idea that it has always been there, and I kept seeing these sort of flashes of it in the behavior that we see nowadays, in terms of critical social justice, and especially I think when I see the behavior of fellow psychologists, especially clinical psychologists. Again, it's online behavior, and we have to take that into account. But when I see the online behavior of clinical psychologists, and I just kept seeing so many sort of patterns that were so similar, as I say, it was like flashes of this model that I had read about, and I couldn't get around the disconnect of how can these people who have chosen, and oftentimes I know have fought very, very hard to get into this profession. Clinical psychology is not an easy profession to get into in the UK. Again, I know it's maybe different in different countries, but in the UK they have to fight very, very hard. It's very competitive. So they have really, really fought. So which I presume means that they are committed to a profession which by all accounts used to be a profession that was designed to be helping people, and was designed to be, non-judgmental, empathetic, open-minded. And I thought, how can these people who have fought so hard to get into a job where the very values are, being non-judgmental and being compassionate, and then they turn around and I see things on social media about them. Literally, I've seen a girl who I know who trained and I think now is a clinical psychologist, talking about drop kicking people because they had a different opinion about asylum seekers. And I have seen that, time and again. I have seen people advocating violence. I've seen hate, literally hate, come out of their mouths. And I think, how do you not see the incongruence here between your profession and also that you're very publicly, these aren't private profiles. They have on their profiles, I'm a clinical psychologist, but they are quite happy to, as I say, advocate violence.
The call to absolutely, and that was something when I was teaching that I saw happen right in front of me. I had some pretty strong boundaries, but outside of that, I was an advisor to some students. So the things I would hear about the call to action in a violent fashion was absolutely abhorrent. It was abhorrent to me. I don't even know how I tolerated it as long as I did. But that is what I saw that was being developed right out of these students that are going to become mental health professionals. And that's kind of, a few things happened for my own light bulb to go off. But that call to action and that call to aggressive action, confrontational, that could even be borderline violent, was supported by the administration.
Yes.
The school's administration.
And you see that again, you saw that in support from supervisors, support from the
everywhere, all of them. Yep.
Absolutely, Christine. And I think the thing that struck me most was anybody saying that you would, in previous times, anybody saying that, if any of my students, regardless of their background, if any of my students behave like that, I would be thinking that is not okay. If anybody I knew, any of my friends, any of my contacts, anybody I knew behaved like that, anybody I saw on social media, I would say that is not okay. That is not, it's not an acceptable way to behave. It is not a balanced way to behave. It is not, it's not rational. There are so many issues with it.
There's so many.
You nicely elaborate on the 5 steps of social identity model and the development of collective hate. You clearly elucidate it very, very well, and you apply it to these different historical events. How do you see these 5 steps taking place within critical social justice?
My model draws upon what's called social identity theory, which is a very you may have heard of it. If you study psychology, you will have done. But it's a very sort of intuitive theory in that it's the idea that we get our sense of identity from the groups we're part of. So pretty much what it says on the tin. So yes, we can see ourselves as individuals with our own individual qualities and beliefs, but we can also draw our sense of identity from the groups that we are part of. So again, I'm sure those of you who work with clients are very, very familiar with this.
So the first step is identification.
Absolutely. So the first step is this identification with a group. In terms of social identity, we draw our sense of identity from whichever groups are important to us. So, for example, for me, it might be, my vegetarian identity, or it might be my female identity. Christine, maybe you don't care at all about your female identity. For you, maybe it's your identity as a therapist or, whatever.
Sure.
So we all have completely different identities that are relevant to us, and it very much depends on what is important to us. And also it can change over time. So, in different contexts, you're more aware of a certain group identity than you are in other ones. The difference between that and critical social justice is that CSJ tells you which groups are important to you.
Yes.
So CSJ says to me, you're a woman, so therefore you're oppressed. It doesn't say to me, so, is your identity as a woman important to you? Do you, are you very aware of this? Does it matter? Are you proud of being a woman? Whatever. It doesn't ask me any of that. It just looks at me and says, in the same way as it looks at me and it says, you're white. It doesn't sort of give you the, what's the word? The privilege of saying, this is the identity that's important to me. It just looks at you and it tells you.
It doesn't allow you to use your own subjectivity, to voice your own subjectivity, and to tell the other,
Absolutely.
I resonate with this type of identity in a group setting.
Exactly.
As it relates to the group. Yes. So that is identification. They impose identity categories and identity markers on people, whether they self-identify or self-relate that way or not.
Absolutely.
That's the big difference.
Yes.
But that's the first step, identification.
Yes. So the first step is you have to identify with the group. Okay. And by virtue of identifying with one group, or one group being important to you and seeing yourself as this group, you must by necessity see yourself as not being part of other groups. So as soon as you start to see the world in terms of groups, then you have created automatically an in-group, or a group of who we are, you know, that I am part of, that matters to me, and then a group that is who I am not part of, you know, a group that is not us, that is other from us. So by, you know, this is the sort of first stages. And critical social justice, as I said, it does this for you. You know, it says to me, you're a woman, so therefore you're different from a man. You know, you're automatically, you know, as I say, it doesn't matter whether my female identity is important to me or not. And critical social justice does this, you know, with all sorts of immutable characteristics. So it does it, as we say, with sex, it does it with race, with
sexual orientation, ability.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sexual orientation, you know, able-bodiedness, you know, all of these characteristics. So the whole point of critical social justice is to split the world into these groups. You know, that's kind of, you know, raison d'etre, you know, is to kind of say, well, here, the world is made up of groups, and these groups are the oppressed and the oppressor. And that actually is the next stage. The next stages of the model to hate is that, you know, first of all, you create an in-group and an out-group. And then you assign virtuous qualities to the in-group. So the group that you're part of, the group that matters to you, you know, you see yourself as being good. You know, you see yourself as, you know, we are working together, where, you know, you assign positive characteristics. And you then view the other group as being negative, you know. So like we were saying earlier about Nazi Germany, you know, the Nazis did this very effectively, you know, the idea of the master race. You know, there's this one group of Aryan, you know, and they were very good at sort of conceptualizing and using images, you know, of the blonde, tall blonde, blue-eyed, and all the rest of it. And then there were the other groups, and they literally used these kinds of metaphors, as we said earlier, about, you know, kind of other groups polluting the gene pool, you know, polluting the master race. So again, we can see how very easily people can create a group and then assign certain characteristics to one group and assign certain characteristics to another. Now, of course, it doesn't have to go like that. You know, as we all know, you know, we can all think of groups in our lives, and, you know, it's not like you necessarily say that this group are good and this group are bad. But if you do, this is the dangerous path to go down.
Precisely.
And the issue is, sorry,
No, and I think this is the nuance that we also need to bring in here. So in-group preference in and of itself is not dangerous. It is so nice when you read the old psychoanalytic literature. Freud himself refers to the narcissism of minor differences, where you could even crack jokes about, yeah, you Scottish, yeah, you English. You know, the Spanish and the Portuguese do it all the time, right? So there's humor, and some of them even believe it as true, but they don't see that as a reason for violence and animosity and hostility.
Absolutely.
So and you see it even with sports teams. That is a stunning display of
absolutely
preference. But you see when the regression starts taking place, the narcissistic regression into this split that you're talking about, where you see where you assign moral qualities to identity markers or to identity groups, then you're going into troublesome territory, where group identity is assigned a moral value, because then you start justifying certain behaviors.
Absolutely. And that is the issue. That is where critical social justice is so dangerous, because like we say, you know, you can have different groups, you know, there's maybe friendly banter or friendly, you know, there is this sort of what should we say, the kind of just acknowledgement and acceptance, and that's okay. But critical social justice doesn't allow for that, because the way it splits, you know, the groups it chooses to split people into are by necessity, you know, by definition, are the oppressed and the oppressors. So then, you know, again, if, you know, taking it to therapeutic example, so then if I go to therapy and I see a therapist who's inspired by critical social justice, and I go experiencing depression, anxiety, whatever, the therapist will say, oh, it's because you're a woman, it's because you're oppressed.
Yes.
They're not going to stop and say, well, actually, is your identity as a woman meaningful to you? You know, do you see yourself as oppressed? They're not even going to consider
That's
that.
where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, with the therapist and being indoctrinated into these programs and ideas, and the passing over of that value set to the client who's in their office.
Yes.
That is right, what you just said. That is right there where the rubber meets the road. That is why the problem in these training institutions with this indoctrination is so it's pervasive, and it's, you know, astronomical to even measure the kind of damage that does.
So much so. And, you know, some people might take my sort of my comparison with this model and obviously, you know, some of the global atrocities, which as being very very exaggerated, which I take the point. Absolutely. But that said, it is the same process, you know, and I think even, you know, on a small level, we can see how it is so harmful, you know, like we're saying in the therapy room, it is so harmful to make these assumptions about people anyway, but then to bring in moral, a moral label, you know, to this without even asking the person themselves. You think, well, what else? You're just asking for trouble, you know, and it's so obvious, I think, if you look at it from that perspective, and you wonder, well, why aren't more people picking up on this? Why aren't our authorities, you know, why aren't they realizing this? Because exactly as you said earlier, Jacko, you know, as soon as you assign these negative qualities to someone, you know, as soon as you characterize someone as being a threat to you, a threat to, you know, what you value, what you love, those you love,
you must
then
destroy them.
all of a sudden it becomes very understandable how people can not only mistreat, not only, you know, talk about violence, but how people can actually conduct it. And, you know, you only need to look at examples on our campuses, you know, and for example, sorry, of Kathleen Stock, horrendous, you know, death threat she was facing, but yet she was the one who had to leave, you know, she had, so I don't know if you're aware of it, but basically she's a feminist, very successful, and by all accounts a very good lecturer, and she was hounded by trans activists on campus and eventually had to leave. She was advised to leave, the police said for her own protection, but again, it's that kind of, in any other aspects of life, if people are threatening others, especially threatening to kill others, they are dealt with appropriately. You know, the police will get involved or, you know, should get involved. And it's considered wrong. But all of a sudden, because this is a group that is perceived to be oppressed, that is perceived to be the victims, all of a sudden you see people trying to justify, well, they try to justify, but you see others trying to justify on their behalf. Oh, but they're the victims here. You can understand why they're threatening her. You know, so many of them are dying, you know, so many of them are victimized, whatever rhetoric they use, you know, and all these unrealistic stats and whatever. And you can understand, though, you can understand why other people, well-meaning people who maybe don't know, will look at this and think, oh, you know, well, yeah, you know, they shouldn't really be threatening people, but it's understandable when they're facing so much, you know, when they are oppressed so much, when they're, you know, when they're threatened so much, it's understandable that eventually they retaliate. But the thing is, it's like, well, are they really threatened? You know, is it, you know, I think, you know,
it's a perceived threat, not it's all in perception, it's perceived, not necessarily an actual. Yaka, did you want to jump in with?
And this is where the perceptual biases and the perceptual blindnesses come in. And I've said it before. So again, comparing the psychoanalytical models with your model, in such a split, the self is idealized. So there is already this bias where the self is exonerated from scrutiny.
Yeah. And it is the same with groups as well, you know, and it is very much
the same
that
with absolutely.
because it's
And
our group.
it is our
right?
group. And remember, we're oppressed. And even though we might not even be now oppressed now, someone is oppressed somewhere else, and we've been oppressed historically.
Yes.
Yes.
And
Yes.
my question is, where do you draw the line? And the point is, with regressed group narcissism, and the self or the in-group is idealized, no behavior is considered so heinous that it couldn't be justified by the victimhood itself.
Yes.
And that is what we see playing out.
That's the key right there.
And that is also the type of rhetoric that we see repeated in psychology too.
Yes.
Yes.
As you point out, references to whiteness. And I think the essentializing language there is deliberate. These people are experts of language. Many of them have studied psychology and psychoanalysis too. They know how language gets registered, maybe not consciously, but unconsciously. That's why essentializing language is deliberate here.
Yeah.
And they could run circles around you if you didn't realize that. And you could confront a person and say, but why do you demonize a race? And they would say, oh, no. I'm referring to whiteness as white supremacy.
Yes.
But let them speak. Then you will hear them referring to whiteness not as white supremacy, but as a reference to not only social identity, but biological identity too.
Yes.
This is genocide talk.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is genocide talk over immutable characteristics. Absolutely.
Maybe we're not there yet, but we don't have to be on the brink of a genocide before we put on the brakes. This is genocide talk. The same with gender issues, you know, toxic masculinity, but you don't hear toxic femininity.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The single narrative that is being promoted along these identity lines, what you've just said, right?
Absolutely. And I think that is what maybe as well another reason that I brought this model in, because for me that is, I think it's concerning on a, you know, just as human beings, I think it's very concerning, you know, this sort of justification of hatred towards certain groups, you know, that is never going to end well, regardless, you know, regardless of your profession, whatever, that is not going to lead to good outcomes. But what I find most concerning is people trying to justify it, you know, people trying to normalize it, you know, and say it's okay, you know, it's okay to talk this way about men because they have oppressed. It's okay to talk this way about white people. But, you know, I think this is why I feel so strongly about it, is that, again, as I said earlier, if anybody said that, I would find that concerning. I would be like, no, that is not justified. You know, you can't hate. In no world is it okay to hate entire groups of people, especially based on immutable characteristics that people can't do anything about. But it's when you have psychologists, like a profession, a group of people that, again, by their very nature, people who are meant to be understanding, compassionate, rational, they are meant to, you know, I think as you spoke about earlier, Christine, you know, they are meant to be people who are meant to be in control of their own emotions, their own, I mean, yeah, we're all human, nobody's perfect. And yes, we all have our own stuff we need to deal with. And nobody expects psychologists to be different. But at the end of the day, in your professional capacity, you need to be balanced. You can't be hysterical.
Absolutely.
You can't be advocating violence. You can't be putting your own
opinions.
This
the cradle of this entire field profession with our founding fathers in psychotherapy were about blank slate. And there was a reason for that. Even though we do not practice with a blank slate in the same way now, the whole purpose of the blank slate was to not have a political leaning or any other preference leaning that would be apparent to your client, that would probably, you know, as a result, influence what your client tells you and influence the relationship between therapist and client, because you're not going to want to upset them, or you're going to loathe them in some other fashion, or you may think poorly about yourself because you were clear that your therapist, who's supposed to be the expert, has a completely different point of view. That's why we started with this whole idea of having a blank slate, so that the conversation, the dialogue, the curiosity, the wondering, the exploration would not be tainted in any way by the therapist's own biases, which are naturally going to be there because we're all human. That this is promoting the use of that, which is pushing even in some way. I mean, it is encouraging the clients to stay within that same level of thinking so that the locus of control stays external rather than internal, and the responsibility is external. You all have to change around me to suit me because this is what I deserve, etc., versus what role I play in creating my life or creating my own perspective or understanding events that happen to me in a different way. So everything becomes about, and when that happens, it never ends, because when it's an external, validation, external needs to adjust to you, you will never fill the hole or feel whole in that regard. That's continues to keep the responsibility away from the person and in another person's hand. And that does not justify somebody who's abused, obviously victimized. We're not talking about those types of things. Clearly, that's not, something they would take responsibility, their fault, obviously. But we're talking about the CSJ component here, right? The critical social justice that will give you full reign and encourage you and compel you to blame the external circumstances.
Yeah. So much of this is because of CSJ. Psychology has just turned into the absolute antithesis of everything that it's meant to be, in terms of it's harming people rather than helping people. It's producing and encouraging people into the field who think their opinion is the only one that's right, and also this opinion needs to be put on everybody else, and if others don't share this opinion, then they need to be punished in some way, and they are somehow morally deviant in some way.
So much for diversity, by the way.
Right, exactly.
How ironic.
And the judgmental attitude and the lack of compassion, the lack of nuance, all of these things that we would really, really hope that a psychologist would have. We have gone the opposite. Every single characteristic that I can see that we would hope a psychologist would have in order to help their clients to be healthy and in order, just to be able to do their job well. I feel like we're recruiting the exact, and we're promoting and we're teaching. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at Carol and I's blatant promotion here, our report about the politicization of clinical psychology in the UK. Yes. And this is what has been promoted. It's not just that it's slipping under, obviously there's variation in terms of the institutions, but it's not just that people are managing, sneaky activists are managing to sort of trick people into, paying them to deliver a seminar. Universities are actively trying to recruit. The thing is, they don't shy away from that. It's very much, and again, the rhetoric that I see from trainees and newly qualified clinical psychologists is, it is political. It's our job to be political, and it is our job to promote these ideas, because again, that's what CSJ is, isn't it? It's very much, you have to be an activist. And again, if you are not with us, then you're against us. It's this whole silence is violence thing. If you don't stand up and say what we want you to say, then you're by nature on the other side. And that means you're a bad person. And therefore it's justified. Yeah, it's justified that we, call you names, that we try and take your job away from you, that we talk about violence towards you, whatever. And that's exactly what's happening. And it's just happening. And nobody apart from us, it's like for you, seem to be kind of aware of what is going. And at the same time, we're talking about mental health crises, and these are getting worse. So
how do we stop this?
Well, look, and this is one little question, not a big one simple question, right?
No, this isn't $1 million question.
Yes.
I think every properly trained, reflective psychologist would know exactly how to stop this. I mean, this is the principle of psychotherapy, of treating the person sitting right in front of you.
Yeah.
You get back to the core values of non-assumption, remain curious and wondering. That's That's it. And
Right.
the changing of the asking of questions from curious and wondering into microaggressions is extreme. I mean, the fly off the charts. I mean, it has no basis. So even within that, you're always going to be you're damned if you do and damned if you don't.
Absolutely. You're in a lose-lose situation. And that's the thing as well that I think is important to think about in terms of this, is how it is transferred into teaching. Obviously, like I am a teacher, and it is very much the case that, you were speaking earlier, Jacko, about kind of not genocide again, obviously but very much this kind of like, if you're part of this group, you can't speak, you can't have an opinion on this. And again, this is coming to like public discourse, it's very it's very common to hear that, men can't have an opinion on women's issues, whatever. And similarly in teaching, it's like, you have to validate, you have to, you can't, even the last few weeks, there was a student who talking about trigger warnings, and another student had actually, I was very proud of it, said, well, actually, trigger warnings are problematic. The use of trigger warnings is actually, at best useless, and at worst it is actually more damaging than not having trigger warnings. And I shared a recent paper stating that, and it was taken down. It's very much, again, sort of come to this censorship as well, that this is the information that we're allowed to state. And again, exactly as you're saying about microaggressions, Christine, again, this is still taught. This is very much taught in social psychology, as well as, again, now it's moved to clinical, but it came from social originally. And again, the notion of implicit bias, all of this, there's not the evidence to support it. There's not the evidence to back it up, but yet, industries are built upon it. We still have to teach it. And if we try and teach other perspectives, if we try and teach the facts surrounding it, that actually there's not the evidence, that is censored. So, the sort of censorship and the kind of like, well, depending on your identity group, you can have an opinion or you can't have an opinion. I can't speak about race because, I'm white. So, it's just a case of like, I'm shut down. So it is very much damaging, not only in terms of, the therapeutic aspect that we've spoken about, but also in terms of learning, and in terms of, the way youngsters in particular are getting brought up, because they are, they're not getting shown the facts. They are getting shown currently critical social justice view of the world, which again, and again, you see that in the rhetoric that the teenagers use. Again, I teach teenagers, and you see it, they talk, it just rolls off the tongue about microaggressions, about, oppression, about
almost scripted.
Yes, absolutely, Jacko. And they've not got the understanding. Oftentimes when you challenge people, if they are open-minded, they sometimes will actually debate. But because the whole point of CSJ is that, again, you're either with us or you're against us, people are increasingly being scared to do that, and people increasingly won't be able to, because they are not allowed to be told the different perspectives. So the whole point is that they shut down evaluation by calling people names, calling people bigots, whatever. So then, of course, people are like, oh God, I better not challenge it. So again, it self-perpetuates. And and it does impact on all aspects of society. We just need to look at, our health institutions, and the language that they use, and the responses they give. Again, I'm sure in the States, you have your own examples, but, we have predatory men being housed with especially Scotland. I'm sure you're aware, we've had quite a few issues in the last few months. But again, it sort of infiltrates all aspects of society. And again, I think people are being very slow to pick up on this. And CSJ is the common theme underlying all of this.
But if we have our shared principles in place, the language will follow.
Yes.
And if
Yes.
if our shared principles would be a return from a common enemy approach to a common humanity approach, our language will change. And that is where the point comes in, where the point that you're making in your chapter. Return to treating the individual as an individual.
Yeah.
We encounter common humanity in the individual. When we prioritize the individual, we encounter common humanity. That's a paradox. We do not encounter common humanity in separate groups, because then we prioritize group identity above the individual, the locus of common humanity.
We're taught to relate on the commonality. The shared humanity is that point of compassion that we see in another human. It's the point of, we've experienced joy, betrayal, sadness, happiness in different ways. The common human experience is that we've experienced what it means to be human in all of its different colors and shapes and forms. That's the connection with the client. That's the connection with another person. Otherwise, you will never be able to treat anyone, because nobody, right, is going to have had the same. So that was the point of introducing ideas of diversity or being open to diversity. That was the entire point, right? This wonderful,
and then it got hijacked.
Beautiful idea that got hijacked. That was all about, don't assume this person has had the same experience, etc. Because, but you can relate to every client you see on some level of compassion or common, moment of having a feeling. However, right, the diversity idea was hijacked into pushing other agendas forward. Clearly, that went the complete opposite from the direction that we were going to go. So this is psychology 101. I mean, I feel like we're in psychology 101 in a bachelor's program. I mean, this is not complicated, right? I mean, I think this is something this very basically. So that's where the whole idea for me of this group think and the in-group, out-group tribalism that takes place starts to have so much more power over somebody than their own ability to reason. Because if you just sit here as a couple of individuals reasoning and being rational, this is not brain surgery, right? This is just should be exactly just known that that's right. And the power of that groupthink, the power of wanting to be good or looked at as good, so you don't question the narrative.
That's how you degrade communities and society. Precisely that.
Yeah,
wow,
absolutely.
There's been all of it's powerful, but I think what you wrote about takes a lot of courage. To use a cliche, it takes courage to be able to sort of liken what is going on by drawing parallels in history of such catastrophic, inhumane, the destruction, crimes against humanity, drawing some parallels as to why that happened into what we're seeing today. I think that takes a lot of courage to do that, because people don't want to have that conversation. It's so hot topic to even say that, even have those words in the same sentence. So I really just want to commend you for being able to kind of put that down in writing, because I very much agree with you, and I very much see how it all connects. And so, I'm just really grateful, I think we all are, that you were willing to put that down, because this is the type of stuff that people are not talking about, and they're not printing, they're not releasing this type of information or that particular viewpoint, and it needs to be heard, so we can have a better framework of understanding. And so I really commend you for doing that, because I think that was very bold and incredibly crucial. I mean, it gives us an entire lens to understand what's happening here and what we have to do to go back, right, to stop it, to reverse, pivot. So, thank you so much for doing that and for coming on. And Jakob, if you have some closing remarks as well.
I echo your sentiments, Christine. I think you also did an impressive job. Look, all these chapters are fantastic and well researched, well argued, well developed. And thank you for your contribution. I really appreciated reading your chapter.